Hello, Neil Petrie from Free and Equal, and today I'm talking fire and ice, and this is about the economic world. But just to start off with, let's always remember them who came before, okay? And in particular, never apologise for being patriotic. First, I thought I'd talk a bit about what I did doing my bit and why that might be relevant to what's going on in this talk today. Yeah, I was intelligence corps for some time in the military, and then I moved into the security industry. For about a good 15 years, I was working in 12 different countries around the globe, mainly over in Central Asia. And then after that, I had various roles in a number of industries, low and high level, before moving full-time 2020 into full-time authoring and freedom and democracy activist. Have I gone too far? Yeah, right. So let's start then. Here we are. Fire and ice. What's it all about? Financial, insurance and real estate is where we go with the fire. And this is really about the false economy that we really live in today. And then the other one, the ICE being investment creation economics, which is about a growth economy. So this is what I'll be talking about now, and in particular looking at it so you understand it, that this is in fact about global economic warfare. So let's have a look. It's a covert conflict. It's one between what I call the Washington Con or the Washington Consensus and the Berlin Consensus, which has practically been rubbed out actually, and then lastly the Tokyo Consensus, which is what the Chinese utilise today. But I'll be making all of this clear for you as we go forward. So, but what they all understand, all these three consensus as they are, different economic systems as it were, under the capitalist system, is they understand that who controls the money supply controls the nation. And let's have a look now. Banking on secrets. Why would that be? Well, because the investment credit creation process is in fact a forgotten US policy of World War II. How do you think they managed to massively build up their economy during the war, straight after their depression? How did they manage that? Well, we'll be talking about that soon. And what I'm going to be talking about with the ICE and the investment credit creation process was a Japanese state secret from 1946 to 1961. And in the UK, it was even a classified confidential document in the 1980s. So we'll look first at the Washington Con. America on fire. Fire, insurance and real estate. An unreal economy. Okay, that is US Fed dominated. Private bankers, in particular the New York Fed, which dominates all of the others. And at its front is the Bank of International Settlements. Sorry, the Bank for International Settlements. Now that was set up in 1930, but I'll be talking some more on that, which is basically the overarching banking central bank. And then finally, if you look at this with the IMF, the World Bank, etc., they're the policy enforcers for the Washington Con. Next, the Berlin Consensus. As you can see, it's a Eurocentric, prudent banking system. It's the one that the Deutschmark did so well under back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but came a cropper when it came to the ECB being imposed. It was an industry-supporting savings bank system. That's how it operated. They had very capable bankers working with their local industrialists to make the economy work, and to ensure that they had these thousands of local branches that they had around the country, were championing lots of small and medium-sized enterprises. A lot of them became world innovation leaders in their fields. Now, last, we'll have a look here at the Tokyo Consensus, hard ice as I call it. And the Tokyo Consensus is about investment credit creation, directed by the central bank, in particular at first in Tokyo, obviously, with the Central Bank of Japan. Basically, it's a national bank of mum and dad at the national level, looking after the nation. Has a laser focus on growth, and it created all those miracles and tigers that we saw in the Far East. And then it was in fact the version that was copied by China. Not the Washington Consensus, not the Berlin Consensus. It was Deng Xiaoping, as I will explain more fully shortly, in China, copying Japan. Right, fire then. Let's have a look first of all at the world on fire. The world on fire. Right, real global GDP in 2024, as you can see here, $110 trillion. But GDP is real goods and services. And non-GDP includes speculation on assets, all of the stuff that we see with the Americans in the derivatives market. And they are really just bets. They are just bets. Don't forget that. Look at that June figure. 730 trillion for the same year as you had 110 trillion in real business. Because if you look at it, they're basically banking on bets. Yep. Each counterparty on a derivative trade is taking one side of a bet. Very simple. On this particular date, the interest rate will go up or it'll go down, and one side says one side says the other. So you get the interest rate swaps, which in 2013, for instance, were 80% of the derivatives market. As I've said, you can say it's going to go up or down or stay the same, whatever you want. Okay, there's almost no limit on the contracts that can be written, and of course that means trillions of dollars being charged out in terms of the money that they can. A small percentage of that, obviously they're not charging that amount out, but it gives you an idea they're charging that out. Now if we look at this, we had of course a problem in 2008, but first of all let's look at the great central banking book by Walter Bagehot in 1873, still pretty much the manual they use. Every great crisis reveals the excessive speculations of many finance houses, which no one before suspected. In other words, they're up to something, and we weren't to find out until the problem had arisen. And what problem arose in 2008? The banks and the hedge funds, of course, with what they call over-the-counter derivatives, their casino, failed massively. Because the net risk appears low, doesn't it? When you have a bet and you've got a winner and a loser, it appears that there is, what's the risk? But then of course reality bites, and you look at Lehman Brothers collapsing, Bear Stearns collapsing, AIG collapsing, and the bankruptcies involved. Then your counterparties become unhedged because the other party no longer is able to pay out. So that is what happened in 2008. And what do we get? Hank Paulson. Yes, here we are. Let's have a look at that. What did he have to say for us? Here we are. I don't see subprime mortgage market troubles imposing a serious problem. Oh, really? I think it's going to be largely contained. There you go. There's our brainy Paulson. And what did he do for us? Well, 19th of September 2008, don't forget, formerly the Goldman Sachs chairman and CEO, has to go and tell Bush, President Bush at the time, several $1 trillion will be needed to save the banks. What they didn't tell you at the time was that Congress secretly lent $16 trillion. Going well, isn't it, for fire? Let's look now, and let's look at the consequences of that. And that's Warren Buffett, as many of you will know, one of the, certainly the most famous of the investors out there. What does he say about derivatives? Well, of course, he calls them weapons of financial mass destruction. Let's look at the consequences prior to this failure in 2008. Well, the smaller savings and loan racket that collapsed in the 80s when Reagan was president, 800 of these financial scammers were jailed. 2008? None. There may have been one or two that slid through and got hammered for something, but basically most of them, and I can't find the record even now of the one or two that I heard might have been done in the past. So from 800 for a smaller loss to trillions and trillions of damage caused for the taxpayer, nothing happens. So the problem remains. You've got Deutsche Bank, again back in 2013, its derivatives book, in other words the business it had in the bank's books, was still 21 times Germany's gross domestic product. This is the problem you've got. And then you had an IMF report that came out that it said that exposure is concentrated among a few highly interconnected banks. The derivatives markets as risk-sharing institutions have an implicit moral hazard problem that undermines their social usefulness. Absolutely. So, let's have a look now at the major problem then. As you can see, oh, yeah, better luck next time, Mr. Investor. Better luck next time, the national central banks and the people. The major problem still remains that profit is privatised and risk is socialised under this very American system. Now, it gets worse. You've got the central banking scammers. Yeah, we're not talking about nationals who are interested in their nation's progress. We are talking about central banking scammers who believe they're above the system. So, the stark reality is laid out for us in Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. There it is. There's the book. 1966 it was published, and Carroll Quigley was a famous professor at Georgetown University. And he wrote this: the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. So let's have a look at these tinfoil hat people at Georgetown University at the time. As you can see there, you've got Carroll Quigley. When he dies, he's a revered Georgetown University professor, and his student in the mid-60s, late 60s, there he is, Bill Clinton, there he is in 1968, and he looked on Quigley as his favourite lecturer. So we're not talking real tinfoil hatters, are we? But we'll get more onto that later. So, what's the score with this then? Central banking. To be sovereign, the people must control the central bank. If you're in control of the central bank, we are sovereign. If we do not control the central bank, then we must set out to do so. Or have no central bank. It's been done before, even in the States for many, many years, decades in fact, before they took on the Fed again in 1913. So, let's have a look though. We've got a problem. Enter the Bank for International Settlements. There's the old building where they were housed previously. And that's the Central Bankers Bank. Oh. So, now we're looking at the BIS, and in fact, so we see here, mostly independent banks, the central banks around the world now, they're mostly independent of their government. But what are they then? Are they subsidiary to the BIS? I believe they are. Now, and in fact, you can pretty much guarantee they are from if you study deeply this matter. And here we've got the former president of the Bank for International Settlements. I have no time for politicians. They lack the judgment of central bankers. Well, of course they do, Fritz. So who rules? Them or us? Our representatives? Even they don't. So, doing the biz. What do, these people? They implement monetary reforms, simultaneously changing things to avoid arbitrage. So this is where they are independent of the rest of us. That is the problem. They do as they wish. And in some ways it's understandable you've got to avoid these issues with arbitrage, because that is the simultaneous purchase and sale of equivalent assets or of the same asset in multiple markets in order to exploit a temporary discrepancy in prices. So you can understand why they have to coordinate those, but it doesn't put them above us without any democratic control over them, and we have basically our central bankers under the cosh of these people in the BIS. That's the main problem. So, let's have a look. Managing the planet. This is the problem that we've got. You've got the BIS board meets basically every 2 months. On a Sunday, they have a big fancy dinner together. The major bankers, there's usually about 15, 20 of them, so if I remember correctly, because there are 63 central banks, in fact, with 95% of global assets under their management. And they have an informal dinner. No notes are taken. Yeah, oh yes. We don't want any names and we don't want any notes, because on the Monday they'll formalise issues on paper. But even then, it's an institution that is lawless, completely lawless, it's outside of the law, even in Switzerland where it is housed. It's got the craziest institutional setup documents that there are probably on the planet, which is a complete disgrace. Alright, but what's the Fed's role? As you've noticed there, we noticed earlier when Carol Quigley was talking about the control centrally of all of these banking groups. And if we've got the major group in the world is the Fed, and the major group within the Fed is the New York Fed, then what is their role and what is their capability? Well, let's have a look. Here you go. Those Fed failures. A quick read through a report on how they failed the United States in the 1930s and brought them the long depression. From the fall of 1930 through the winter of 1933, the money supply fell by nearly 30%. In other words, they weren't putting the cash into the system that was required by the banks to keep normal business ticking over. Was that an accident? Was that them deciding that they had to clean out a lot of businesses that they thought of as weak, so they thought they would crush them without the money? Or was there an ulterior motive where by crushing those businesses they would be going cheap? Because look, the declining supply of funds reduced average prices by an equivalent amount. This deflation increased debt burdens, distorted economic decision making, reduced consumption whilst increasing unemployment, and forced banks, firms and individuals into bankruptcy. That's interesting, isn't it? Especially when the Bank for International Settlements was set up in 1930. So what are we doing with FIRE's asset grab? Let's have a look. There's an investigation of this, an investigation of the central banking scam. It wasn't really started as an investigation, but these books here give proof of this strategy behind the refeudalisation that Carol Quigley covered in 1966 in Tragedy and Hope. So there it is. Where does money come from? One of the authors to that was Richard Werner, who you can see in the second book, which is The Princes of the Yen, of which there is a superb documentary you can watch, only about an hour and a half. I'll cover that later, where he covers the whole process that he saw of this strategy in operation in Japan. And then finally, the last book there is from George Tate Edwards, and he talks about the Princes of the Yen because he's an expert in Shinomoran economics, the Japanese growth methods that they adopted and implemented after World War II. So, what does George, the expert, have to say? He calls The Princes of the Yen, the investigation that I've told you about, the best book ever written about the Japanese financial industrial system, and I've read hundreds during the last 40 years. This is an astonishing, timely and well-written book. Werner's observations have a direct relevance to the European and American contexts. It contains better growth assisting policies than any currently being taught, reported upon or practiced in the West. A truly great book. Well, he wrote that back in the early 2000s, and where are we today? Do we have people who are looking at our industrial policy and credit creation to grow it like the Japanese and all those Asian countries have? I'll cover that more in detail, but these are the issues that we face today in the West. So, here he is, Professor Richard Werner. There he is in Dubai, being introduced as the foremost experts in CBDCs. That was at a meeting last year there. So, first we need to understand FIRE. It's basically shareholder-focused capitalism. It is designed to make a few people with a lot of interlocking directorships in many companies, pulling them together so that back in 2015 you only had 30 groups around the world held over 50% of the capital, of the ownership of the 300 largest companies in the world. That's all, just 30. Some of them were national in terms of the sovereign funds, but most of the top 10 are financial houses. Not companies, financial houses. So, up against them were the investment credit economics nations. These are nation-focused capitalism. Well, the central bank has done one, now do they? They're the international globalist elite. The last thing they want is nations being strong on their own. So, let's have a quick look then at shareholder-focused capitalism. It's more fake news. Just as you heard with the lone shooter theories, with the conspiracy theories for these various killings in the 60s and the 70s, in particular obviously the Kennedys. And what are we finding today? This fake news, I'll cover that shortly. But basically, they're now saying 2 shooters because they're investigating this. That's why they held the file shut, because it covers up all of these major crimes, but beyond that, there's the systemic nature of them, which includes the economic systems, and the Washington Consensus is all part of that cover-up. So, banks are not financial intermediaries. They do not lend savers money to borrowers in the straightforward fashion that people are told. That is not the case at all, and that was covered in the first book that I showed you about Creating Money by Richard Werner and 3 other authors. They create money, in fact, to lend. In other words, they just tap in their keyboards and produce the required money on the keyboard for the loans that they're going to make. Yes, they look into the creditworthiness of those that they're going to loan to, but they don't necessarily need any cash in the bank, and the reserves that they need can be a tiny amount, and they go well above those that they're supposed to hold by the laws and regulations of the central banks. In fact, the UK in 2008 had 80 times, the banks had 80 times more lent out than they had in credit of their own in their banks, to give you an idea. So, let's look now. The shareholder focused propaganda. Okay? It's theoretic, academic claptrap. Believe it or not, the Chicago University was set up by Rockefeller, and he thought it was the best investment he ever made, because they had put out all of these theories and texts and books by pet little economists who had pushed their line. And in fact, they failed miserably. You'll see shortly the results for other systems than the American one. But the American one ensured that they held on to the shareholding. And that's what it's about. Strong shareholders demanding high dividends, not reinvestment. This is the difference again with the systems I will talk to you about. Management and workers at the mercy of a few shareholders, especially foreign ones who can pull out the money anytime they want, and the firm can collapse. Okay, and this is what we're talking about, a loss of independence, because your funding is from the markets, from these few shareholders, not from banks, which means that all of the growth is retained within the company. It's not then fed into the hands of shareholders, and that the company will decide where to reinvest it and what bonuses to pay to the people who work in the companies, for instance. So, how do we find ourselves in this position? How did we end up on the road to hell? Well, I'll tell you. Here you go. This is an obituary notice, you might say, to Cecil Rhodes, printed in the New York Times, I think it's the 9th of April, yes, 9th of April 1902. And it's a sorry tale to sell us. But here you go. I've marked up a little bit for you, which is the only thing feasible to carry out this idea that Rhodes had of taking over the world as an Anglo-American banking cabal. The only thing feasible to carry out this idea is a secret society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world, and to be devoted to such an object. So, the paths converge then, Rhodes and the Americans. So we had W.T. Stead wrote the last will and testament for Rhodes, and Stead was the outstanding journalist of his day in the UK back in the 1880s and through to the 1900s. In fact, he went down with the Titanic. Right, but although there have been many wealthier men, none of them before Mr. Rhodes recognised the opportunities of ruling the world which wealth affords its possessors. So remember that. This was in 1902, I think, as well, that this book came out. This was openly published. And there he was laying out how it works for Rhodes and his type. Today, of course, you don't get that, because the press is controlled. British press is much more controlled than it's ever been in our lifetimes. But obviously, they're trying to screw down the doors again now, after we'd escaped using the internet. Now they're trying to shove us back inside the room in the prison. So, but in the American side, you had the open door policy, and that was a diplomatic principle initiated by the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it aimed to prevent any single nation from monopolizing trade with China. Basically, they wanted to monopolize it, but they didn't want anyone else monopolizing it. But that was their eventual plan, and it remains so today, I believe. And I believe I'm correct in that. Right, the kindergarten. And the kindergarten was the group of people that used the funds that Cecil Rhodes left. And they were left, Lord Milner took over the reins, and then, and you can see that in the last will and testament, he then used this team around him to go around and to focus on the vision that we had from Rhodes, or they had from Rhodes. They set up the Society of the Elect, the Round Table groups, and in 1919 in Paris, the Institute of International Affairs was set up back in England after the Paris Agreements, where the British negotiators had met with J.P. Morgan and his, or the J.P. Morgan associates at the same Paris armistice talks to do the same in the United States. And in America, the plutocracies tool was set up. 1919, there was a club in America where they set up a council on foreign relations, as you might say, the infamous CFR, as it is in some locations now, which is of course independent and non-partisan. But the aim was to utilise the plans and thoughts that had been put forward by Rhodes. As we see today, as I've said to you, 2015, only 30 groups now control half of the world's major companies. So, what did they do, these people? Well, the control swung from the Morgan group, because he died childless, into the Rockefeller hands as they grew more and more powerful. And they ended up putting money into the hands of the CFR to go through and advise the State Department in the United States, 1939 to 1945, on the post-war economic setup, what would become the Washington Consensus. So they created US policy through the State Department, known as the coup of coups. They basically took it over and ran the post-war planning for the United States, which was a global effort, basically leaving out the Soviet Union, parts of Europe, and the British Empire, parts of that, but with the aim of obviously taking over from us in the British Empire globally, which is what they have done. And you can find this in the Power Elite. It's all covered in that. Now, they created what is known as the Grand Area in 1940, even before the bombing in Pearl Harbor, to give you an idea. This was all planned within 2 weeks of World War II starting in Europe. The Americans were sitting down planning the Grand Area. That was what the CFR was there for, paid for by Rockefeller. And since then, since 1947, the money boys on Wall Street basically got the NSA set up, the CIA set up, the DIA set up, the War Department became the Defense Department to give it a softer name, and the list goes on. Let's have a look at that list. Alright. Of the deputy directors, all 7 of those that I could find traces for were basically from Wall Street in some form or other, either legal lawyers like Alan Dulles, or from the financial circles themselves, bankers, many of them. So the ones that you can find the names for were all from Wall Street. It was a game. It was the part of this global control and asset stripping of the planet for the Americans and the American economy. So, and when they created firms, those were at cost to the taxpayers, but the profits were privatised. Sounds like a good scam, doesn't it? So here we go then. Endless wars, rocketing profits, rising asset prices. A lot of inflation, but they're sitting on top of it, stripping out the cheap assets and grabbing hold of them as they rise in price. And then of course they could spin from wars against Soviets to the Islamists, both of whom they helped grow, as you can see if you go study your history books. So, as they say, let's follow the money. The US has 800 families that provide 70% of the political funding for all of the campaigns in the political field in the United States. So they're looking for pliant candidates. They're favoured, naturally. And now, fortunately for us, we've got the Trump JFK investigation and the lone shooter theory, and that's already been nixed. Yes, we see that 2 shooters in the JFK assassination as the FBI investigation hits home. So they've lied for decades. Now it's coming out. Hence the lockdown on our truth, the lockdown on our press, and the lockdown on free speech. But how have they managed to go around the world then? They've used these economic hitmen since World War II. After the Bretton Woods Agreement, the agencies were established, the IMF, the World Bank, etc., working along with their senior partner from the Bank for International Settlements, so that whenever competitors appear, these miracles and tigers, they can be allowed to grow. Then the hitmen turn up, strike, and ensure that reform is undertaken in line with the Washington Consensus. So these crises are engineered, the booms and busts, the long recessions, and the assets being acquired by the US. This is eventually deliberate. Do not think there's no strategy behind it. There is. There's always a strategy. Not always simple to find, not always working well, but someone's trying to do something. And if it works out 51% of the time, they're happy. They're still ahead of the game. But the common denominator you'll find is the central bank collaborators amongst those countries where the Americans eventually acquire enough central bank control of the nations concerned to fashion the economies in the form they wish to have. But let's look at that then. Let's look at the ICE economies, the investment credit economies. So, and how has ICE performed? Why do the Americans see it as such a threat? Okay, because by the 1980s, don't forget, America was losing its economic war with Germany and Japan. German billionaires, even today, per head, are 4 times those in the US. Much smaller economy, but they're roughly the same number of billionaires because the money is spread more widely. The success is spread more widely. It is not filtered into fewer hands as it is in the United States under the Washington Consensus, the Washington Con, and not as it is under the Berlin Consensus, which is a better system. Okay, so they've had higher growth in these competing economies for decades. That is in Germany in particular, before the ECB, funnily enough. And they had low inflation, low debt, again before the ECB. And look at the problems today with the German economy. But let's look then, where did this come from, this idea? Well, here's Hjalmar Schacht. He was Hitler's banker, but he worked out a method of strategically guiding credit creation. It was known as the war model, and this was tested by Schacht, okay, and he was basically ensuring that the particular industries that needed funding were funded, and that the new monies that they produced in the central bank, or the central bank allowed to be produced by the banks, was directed towards those, obviously the war effort industries and the acquisition of the raw materials required for that. And this system was adopted and adapted and tested in what is Manchuria, at the time was known as Manchukuo, which was a province of China that was taken over by the Japanese. So, Japanese war model then, let's have a look at what they did, because they worked on a similar system to Schacht. It's national interest banking. Okay, the GDP investments are favoured over non-GDP waste. In other words, where something is going to make money, it is better to put your money in there, of course, than to put into something that will not make money. So this is how the investments that they give, this extra money that the credit that they create for these industries, is paid back by successful large businesses using new tooling, new equipment to ensure high technical capabilities, which leads usually to much higher productivity and cheaper goods which sell well in the global market. That's how Japan had so much success. Okay, as we say here, the strategic industries were favoured. Toyota, Nissan, Isuzu were the 3 car companies that received a lot of this favoured treatment. And in them, what they did was they elevated the role of the managers. Employees were motivated because they had greater control of the company through the company staff. Shareholders were largely eliminated because they will just be looking for profits to strip out that will not be retained and used as a reinvestment to ensure that growth is magnified. So these are strategic ideas which haven't got time to go into all of them, but it gives you an idea that the money is retained in the company, they buy better equipment and they produce faster, quicker, better vehicles, whatever it was they're making. So, who's the experts in this? Well, here's the man largely credited with this, Osamu Shimomura, the Asian Keynes you might call him. 1934 he visited the US, 39 to 45. It's not known where he was, but he's probably in Manchuria, where, as I said earlier, a lot of these systems were trialled. And then in 1945 to 46 he went to the US, because as you'll see in a moment, I'll show you where this system first arose and why he learned so much when he was in the States. He came back and then he was for a long time working in the Bank of Japan, which of course is their central bank, and he wrote the policies that gave Japan its fantastic growth. Now his books were not translated into English. That's on purpose. 8 of them out there, and the 2 that were not fully translated, leaving out the important parts. But let's look now, what did he learn when he was in the States? Roosevelt had failed magnificently, you might say, massively should I say, to alleviate the Depression 33 to 39. But the war economy boomed. The war economy and the idea behind it saved America. And this was that they produced long-term, low-interest loans, and no loan would be refused that would get in the way of slowing up war production. So they had phenomenal expenditures, as you're probably aware, with the atom bomb and lots of other industrial requirements. And they used investment credit. They created credit in massive amounts, as you will see. Right, so look at that for deficit spending. 1940, 5.6% of the GDP was the amount that they were in deficit. By 1943, they were spending so much cash, they were 31.3% of GDP in deficit. But look what they managed. Shipping increased 72-fold. That is accurate, 72-fold. Industrial construction, 16-fold. And productivity increased by an average of about 8.5% per annum. So, the giant emerges from the war. The post-war effect remained. In fact, you know, the growth of the economy in the construction side was still 4 times what it was at the pre-war era when Roosevelt was in charge. So this huge boost of funding created a new market, a different country, one that they could run with all of these materials they were using, and the war output had doubled the economy, but post-war it only fell by 9%. So about 20% of the gain that they had made in the war was lost, but the other 80% remained because they used the aluminium to make new things that they hadn't done before, the cars instead of trucks, etc., the cars and all of the household goods, refrigerators, etc., that we remember America for. Those of us who are older, them having much more higher lifestyle than ours. And this was an investment credit triumph. But Japan had learned through Shimomura, but America forgot. So, what did the Japanese learn? Central banking. Right, here we go. 1920s, the Japanese had followed the US model of the economy, being the same as the Americans, same Washington type model you might call it, shareholder heavy. But they, in the 1930s, as they learned from Schacht, they learned that they had to be more strategic in their investments and where they put their cash to ensure that they could produce what they required for their war plans. So they had an alternative to our fake free market that worked. Okay, and the bankers plan in both models, don't forget. The bankers still lend out in the West what they believe will be loans to that will provide funds back for them. And they're not so keen on businesses. They're more keen on easy meat, assets that they can then strip off you when you fail to make your payments back. And they decide, in both systems, they decide on credit allocation. So here we are, Japan's Pope, banking Pope, and he was in charge of the Bank of Japan throughout that period, 46 to 54, another admirer of Schacht. Okay, so they learned from Schacht. I'm not saying Schacht was a great man, I'm just saying that he had come up with these ideas of where you funnel funds. Because you're going to funnel funds, as you will see now in a moment, into various sectors of the economy, some of which work better than others. And the bankers know this. But does it work better for the banker, or does it work better for the economy and the people as a whole? That's the issue. So the Manchurians take over then, and what do? The central bank directs bank credit creation. That's what's happening. And they decide on the levels. They call it window guidance. Okay, and they set loan limits that were to go out. And these would go to the favoured strategic industries and firms, as I mentioned, Nifsan, etc. And they benefited then from Keynes, what was known as the multiplier effect. This is where you put a small amount in, but a bank can then use that amount of money as a base for loaning more, a great deal more than they initially have. So that can be used for good purposes, and that is the point that the Bank of Japan hit upon and utilise that. So it would go into strategic industries, and they would tell them where they could put that funding, and they had to stick to the plan, and I will show you how they did stick to it. Okay, but this, because it's going into productive industries where they make money, they pay off their loans and they pay off the very low interest that is given specifically to reduce inflation. And that system ensured that they had that massive growth that we saw for decades. And this was targeted at technological improvements to ensure productivity increases. It's not just thrown against the wall and whoever grabs a bit can keep it. No. So the point was to use the credit hose at a target or to turn it off. And ICE worked miracles. So the types of credit creation. You've got to think of the parables of the talents if you know your Bible. But basically, you're looking at consumer credit creation was Keynes's idea, the first idea behind this really, that you create the credit to pour into the economy. But it's not the best way to do it. You can have the worst way almost, is the speculative credit creation, which is what you do when you want a boom and bust, and you ensure there's a lot of money available for people to buy housing that will go up in price because it will inflate the prices, and then you just basically come into then no credit creation if you want to create or maintain a recession, because suddenly these people can't get the money to buy the houses and they can't get the money to pay off their loans. So the prices drop and they're available for somebody else to pick up cheap as they have to sell them on. Or you get the investment credit creation, which is targeted for real growth and low inflation, and that's the one I've explained to you about Japan. And you've got finally in the list the original credit creation, which is where you're going to look at some innovations. Japan did this 10-15 years ago, but in the war it was used to ensure that we had the atomic bomb, or the Americans produced that, and for their large synthetics industry that was needed for war goods. But let's look at this chart here. If we look at the chart, you can see the dark complete line, okay, and that is the bank loans line. But look, the ones with the dots on it, that line is the window guidance line that I spoke about. This is what the Bank of Japan had told them they could lend, okay, and then if they stuck to those limits, you see, the bank can come back to the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of Japan will say, right, we'll buy those assets off you because you've got a loan from a good standing industry that will repay. We'll take those off you, so it's now no longer on your books, it's now you have the cash and we will allow you to go and loan more. So this is how they kept doubling the effect of the investment credit that they created as a central bank, and these funds that had been the banks held would come into the national bank, Bank of Japan, as an asset, because these would all be paid off. They would all be paid off by the companies concerned. And did you hear of Nissan not making his payments, or Isuzu? I don't think so. These were well targeted developments. That's how they worked it. Right, so what happened then? Why did it all go wrong? What happened here? Japan's long recession. It happened because the no credit creation system was chosen. And this was because the Bank for International Settlement compliant central bankers were in place then by the 90s, the late 80s and the 90s. And the Bank of Japan in the late 80s massively pushed lending. And the bankers themselves outside of the Bank of Japan wondered why this was happening, because they knew the effect that this would have. So there we are. That's what happened. You end up with asset inflation because you've got this money going into those buildings. As you may remember, many of you, the older amongst us, the cost of land in Japan became prohibitive, completely crazy. And they had a massive bubble. Then you just switched it off, 1990s, no credit, and the bust naturally follows. This is how the scam is done, on a global scale. So Japan's invisible export though, the ideas prior to the central bankers tightening up had been captured by the regulators and the Bank for International Settlements. It was the greatest export that Japan had, because they had ideas that ran counter to our Western theories, the Washington con, and they had their own theories that they'd learned partially from Berlin, or the Berlin Consensus, which I'll explain briefly later, to their own Tokyo Consensus. And they basically used local banks to fund companies, and foreign investors were little needed. And this model was acquired and used across Asia, so they did not need American money coming in. They had their local banks who were quite capable of funding the system from their central banks giving them support. Okay, let's have a look now. The Asian tigers. You'll remember these, many of you. Okay, but the same cut and paste thing happened. The system had been imposed in Korea and Taiwan in wartime by Japan, because they were under Japan at the time. But then the system had been widely adopted, as I said. Thailand, you see them, Malaysia, Singapore, etc. And the growth had been in double digits in the 1970s right the way through to the early 1990s. Why? Because they were using the credit creation system that Japan had taught them effectively. And per capita income grew between the years of the 1960s to the 1990s in that region by 5.5% per annum. This is cumulative, don't forget. But then the Asian crisis comes along, and the 1990s, you get massively pushed lending by the central bank. What's going on here? This time again, for property, foreign loans were favoured. But wait, didn't that just fail a few years beforehand in Japan? Yeah, because what you've got is the central banking traitors. Yep, the original crew in Japan, many of them were bankers who'd been led off by the Americans for war crimes, or they'd done a very short time for war crimes because of the nature of the war and what they were doing in terms of funding it across Asia. But then later on, many of the younger central bankers have gone to the United States to be trained and to get their PhDs from Harvard and all the rest of these schools. But of course they're getting taught a different system. So they were told, you'll need to restructure your economy. And they were not aware of Shimomura's system. It was not the same. By the 80s and 90s, these new PhD guys were coming through, and they were not in the know as the older boys had been using the system to ensure that Japan would grow. There were going to be natural changes anyway. There was obviously going to be pushback from around the world because of Japan's continuing successes. But the bottom line is, it was destroyed because the IMF ensured that that would happen, as did the Americans, ensuring that they would toe the line and ensure that the Washington Consensus would be adopted. Now, don't forget, the Japanese and these Asians had held the US investors at bay. But when you change the system, then that's what happens. You let them in, and then they're able to take out the assets. Hence why, as I said, you've got so many of these companies globally held by these financial houses. Now, let's look then. As I mentioned earlier, China. What happened with China? How did it grow so fast? You've got to think that Deng Xiaoping brought in these ideological reforms. These are not communist, okay? And he had the ideas in 1978 on his return to power. He looked at sorry about the spelling error there, I've just noticed that. Anyway, practice is the sole criterion of truth. And his second motto was seek truth from facts. And he sent over to Japan teams and cadres to go and find out how the Japanese had grown so swiftly. Shouldn't we have been doing the same at some point? Why were our economists so arrogant not to look at these economies that were doing so much better than us, whilst ours are falling into the dust? Could we not have learned something? Well, Deng Xiaoping shows the way, does he not? I'm anti-communist, and these are not communist principles. Deng Xiaoping turned that country around, and it shows us, unfortunately, that communism can continue as a party system layered above the economy. All the theories that you hear from our economists, most of them are tripe. They're fed to you through the Chicago School and these other cretinous economists around the world telling you one thing, and then why is our system so poor in terms of growth compared to those in Asia? Why was our system worse than those following the Berlin Consensus and the German growth and the European growth as well? I'll leave that to you to think about. Now, the Economist said of Deng Xiaoping, about China, that it was Japan's most eager pupil. As I said, they thought about it and they learned. So let's look at China's miracle. The fastest growth in history. I mean, that's telling us straight away something unusual. Over 1 billion people being lifted out of poverty. Because look, 1980, 2 years after Deng had started looking at Japan, there was one colour TV. 1% of Japanese households had a colour TV. Sorry, Chinese households had a colour TV. By 1995, after 3 5-year plans, using the Japanese system, we're now up to 85%. I visited, in fact, China in 2001 when they joined the World Trade Federation, WTF, and it was already booming then. Roads were great, airports everywhere, the system was already flying, and they've had 25 years since in which to continue their improvements, or near enough 25. So, and the final funds that they found that they were putting in to the system, they'd put in say $100 million, it would end up being 3 times that, being 300 million, because of the other inputs that came in on the back of that they had funded centrally. This is how it grows, and then you maintain the growth through the continual re-injection of funds and profits into the system at a much higher and faster scale than we have ever done in the UK or in America, except in World War II, when Americans did exactly this and grew to be the powerhouse that it became, and why it has been sliding for generations now too, because it's not maintained this, and we should be thinking about that obviously for ourselves. So let's look at the German economic miracle. Okay, it's a social market economy that was set up in the 50s, and ever throughout that period, 8% growth. You'll hear all these stories, oh, it's about the rebuilding the war, after the war, blah, blah, blah. But where did the money come for the rebuilding? Again, it's because of the German system was different to ours. They believed in investing. They looked for high growth. Okay, but then eventually the same thing happened to Germany. Structural changes come in. When? Yeah, because of the ECB is being imposed on them. And what happens? The mark was crushed. And here's what Richard Werner has to say. It would also have been difficult for any referendum in Germany to achieve a majority in favour of the abolition of the mark. So they didn't have one, of course. No referendums, no feedback from the people, who understood that the German economy was amongst the best in the world, and because of the nature of the system, where they have banks dotted all around the country, they have their local banks, many of them are not for profit, or were not for profit. There were savings banks, the funds were poured back into their own local industries, hence why Germany became so rich, hence why it has so many billionaires compared to America. The difference in the systems is great, and it's a prudent system with low profits for the bankers but high profits for the nations. Who's winning with the Washington Consensus or the Washington Con? The bankers. Who's winning with the Berlin Consensus? The people. Who's winning with the high growth version, the Tokyo Consensus? China's massive growth, Japan's massive growth, the whole of Asia's growth. Have we got economists in our countries? We've got politicians who talk about economy. Do they know any of this stuff? Have they ever studied it or thought about it or proposed it to you? Or are they backed by the bankers? Are they backed into a corner by the bankers? This is the issue. You've got the Eton boys in the UK who know nothing about systems like this because they come from those families that are already benefited by the system, not thinking about the country. That's a veneer. They turn up for November the 11th and what do? They don't care really, most of them, I'm sure. I'm sure of that. Enough on that. Anyway. Right, central banking then. The central banking traitors. As I say, the ECB was imposed on Germany. You've got the US trained PhDs who believe in this tripe because they've been fed it for years at their economic schools. But how many of them have gone out and investigated, like Richard Werner, who worked in Japan for many years at a high level inside the system? So he came to see how the bankers, the central bankers, undermined the economy. And this was deliberately done. They restructure the economy and destroy it, as they have done in Germany. And in fact, he goes on in chapter 20 of his book, The Princes of the Yen, which I recommend extremely highly, and you can get the English version. And in there's a chapter 20 that has reappeared in his latest edition. It was left out because it was not allowed in the original version, because basically it showed that Greenspan had turned traitor. He had been against the central control of banking by the central bank in the terms that I've just explained to you. But he did exactly that. How long was the bubble left to run under Greenspan? How many years before we had the 2008 downturn, the crash, Greenspan's crash, simple as that. And yet he had argued against those types of policies when he was a young man and his PhD was written. But that is what is covered in chapter 20 of the book, because Richard Werner met Greenspan and asked him the question, and Greenspan basically turned on his heels and left him. So what you see is these bankers and the system controllers in the West, they've been captured or have enjoyed Rhodes' vision and the deep state that they have created. They are the ones who benefit from that. And then when you look at the UK, how do we do? Overseas investors are favoured. Tax breaks left, right and centre. And the US, don't forget, is controlled by only 800 families largely, who have 70% or put 70% of the funding that goes into the campaigns of the politicians over in the United States. These figures come from Robert F. Kennedy, the current cabinet member in Trump's cabinet. That's the reality. Money has bought the compliance of companies, regulators and government, and the insurance of the laws that favour this consensus over the one that will give us greater growth, over the one that will give us greater control. Now, back to the UK. In the 1980s, those Americans only owned 3% of our stock market. Today, it's 30%. Here, don't forget, I'm only talking Americans. How much is owned by other foreigners, I don't know at this stage. But I can also tell you, in 2016, the UK had only 5 banks and they were holding 90% of the deposits in the system. So we do not and have never had a system like Germany's, and in fact all of Europe's, where you have many local banks that look after local smaller businesses and ensure that they grow. They create the credit to give to small businesses who are proven businessmen and can do a good job for the nation. No, what they're interested in is huge stocks, funds, and playing the game with derivatives. As I showed you, even Deutsche Bank caught up in it, 21 times the GDP of the Germany. So what's the escape plan then? Well, here we are. What we need, if we're going to escape, is to have a UK central bank that we really control through a direct democracy, so that people have control of our government system and ensure that we then bring the central bank back under our control so that it is democratically and politically controlled, not from some bank over in Basel in Switzerland. Okay, and that is then tasked to ensure growth using ICE, the investment credit system, wisely. And then its targets are set and performance is rewarded or sanctioned. That's how we have to operate. Not allowing these people independence without any sanction on their failures. Speculation needs to be controlled. Basically, the old rule was always invest only what you can lose. That was always the advice I remember, and certainly I stuck with that. So the reality is, we've got these people who are out of control, and what we need is to get them under control and bring in lots of local banks who are supporting local businesses. We should look again at the German model on that, and then decide how we can structure our own banking system over here. Now, interestingly, the only people cutting the central bankers down to size are the Swiss with their referendum. Yeah, they have a referendum on the height of the headquarters here, as you can see, in Basel. And they said, oh no, we don't want it to be 24 stories, I think it was, 23 stories. So they had to end up putting 4 stories underground. So they were cut down to size on a referendum. And that's why we need a rights to referendum democracy, because it cures most ills, even in banking. If I just go back for a second, macroeconomics again, this book here is written by Richard Werner. He's been over in the States advising on organising a sovereign state bank. So this is already being looked at across the United States and a number of the states over there. So Richard Werner is starting to have a deep effect, hopefully, even in the States. And then looking in particular at Tennessee. So there is a way out of this mess. This is the basic model. It's the one that he provides and discusses, and I support largely. I see no reason not to. He's a much greater expert than I am. So, and I think that's what we should be looking at. So let's have a look at your homework for today is going to be, I'd suggest you could watch The Princes of the Yen to get us started. It's an hour and a half long video, well worth the watch, and it will cover much of this ground. But it's a very well made one. I mean, it's very watchable for a documentary. It's well put together. Whoever put that together were a very professional and entertaining crew. Now if we go to the next one, this is what we need. Rights to referendum democracy. That's where we got to go. Yes please, let's have some of that. And finally, my book is coming out this summer, The Right to Referendums Democracy, titled Saving the Nation. And up here, Elon Musk loves direct democracy too. And I think he's a rather successful businessman. And he understands that the right to referendums democracy gives you a much more honest and less corrupt system. Unlike the Washington Con, more like the Berlin consensus, more like the growth system that China adopted in basically covering or imitating Japan. That's it. I'll finish off there with my direct democracy movement flag for you. But that's all from the show today, and I wish you all the best from Free and Equal, and Neil Petrie signing off. Have a good day.